Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time for another video in my How Did They Do That series, where I take questions you guys have left in the comments about how classic games pulled off their various tricks and answer them. Maybe a question you provided is going to appear in this one, or maybe someone else has been thinking about a question you've also always wondered about, so let's put another set of games under the microscope to figure out what makes them tick. Let's get stuck into it. We're starting with the Game Boy this time around, with this question from Conanarian, who says that Asterix on the Game Boy uses what appears to be parallax scrolling throughout the entire game, and wants to know how it works. Remember, this is the original Game Boy we're talking about here. It only had one background layer, so did the developers drink some of that magical potion to gain superhuman coding skills? Let's find out! In case you're unaware, Asterix is a series of comic books that's been around for almost 50 years at this point, originally written in French, but has now been translated to over 100 languages. It was one of my favourites growing up, although I don't remember the words being quite so blurry when I was younger. They are full of clever jokes, cultural references and puns that somehow work across language barriers, and they're still making new books to this day. The various books in the series have been adapted into both animated and live-action movies over the years, and of course video games. The question is specifically asking about the original Game Boy game that we see in action here, which isn't based on a specific book as far as I'm aware and is an original story. And check out that parallax scrolling. It actually looks like there's multiple background layers all scrolling at different rates, but that's not possible on the Game Boy, so how is that happening? The Game Boy did actually have a scanline counter and was able to scroll individual portions of the screen separately, and we've seen other games like Prehistoric Man doing this in previous videos. But that's not what's going on here. This is another technique that we've seen a few times in the past, although it's the first time we've seen it being used on the Game Boy, and that's animated tiles. The tiles that are making up the portions of the background that are moving independently to the rest are animated to move when the player does, making it look like they are actually scrolling and creating the illusion that there's multiple background layers. If we isolate the tiles in VRAM, we can actually see them animating. It's a trick that seems so simple when you think about it, but was surprisingly rare to actually see in practice, and it can be really effective when used well, as we can see here. This next question comes from NobodyLux348, who says, 3D Pocket Pool is a 2001 Game Boy Color game with a reasonably accurate title. That is, the action of the game takes place on a convincingly rendered 3D pool table, with the player being able to control the viewpoint. Given the context of playing pool, the control the player has over the camera feels about as unlimited as it needs to. How did they achieve this? For context, this was in response to what I said in this video, where I said the GBC can't render polygons. So what's happening in this game? Let's do a break shot, sink a few balls, and find out what's going on. So this is 3D Pocket Pool. As far as snooker games go, it's about as good as you'd expect, especially on a platform like the Game Boy Color. The ball physics make them behave more or less how you'd expect them to behave, and you can see the trajectory of the balls before you hit them, which is nice, and there's multiple different rule sets you can play by. Obviously, this game's gimmick is that you can rotate the camera around the table in order to change your view, and it looks like a very convincing 3D effect. You'll notice the camera can only be rotated, it can't be zoomed in and out or have its height adjusted. To gain a proper understanding of exactly what's going on in the game's code, I reached out to programmer Nick Pelling, who was awesome enough to give me some of his time. He explained that the table graphics were pre-rendered from all of the different viewing angles, which were then converted to tiles and compressed into the ROM. In order to save on space, they only did about half of them, with the other half done by flipping them horizontally. Depending on the table angle, almost all of the visible tiles could be using the mirrored versions. The game works out the next tile set it needs and decompresses it, and utilises the scanline counter to horizontally scroll individual tiles at slight offsets to each other to give the impression of 3D parallax. Something I didn't actually notice until he pointed it out is that the tiles making up the front cushion are set to high priority, so they appear in front of the balls, which are all sprites. I'll return to what Nick said about decompressing the next tile set here because it's worth expanding on. The Game Boy and the Game Boy Color could both have two tile maps loaded into memory at once, and usually this second tile map was used for the window, but it didn't have to be. What this game does is that instead of using it for the window, it's used as a kind of frame buffer. It decompresses the next set of tiles it needs for the next frame into that memory address in VRAM and then swaps to it, alternating which one is rendered on each frame. It's a really clever use of that second tile map. One last thing is that if you've seen footage of this game running in an emulator, or you've played it on an emulator yourself, you might have seen the balls flickering, like this. This was sometimes done in games for older devices like the Game Boy to simulate a transparency because the LCD screen had a slow response time, but viewing it on a modern screen with a fast response time just looks like a flicker. Some emulators these days have a frame blending option that removes the flicker and makes it look more like how it looks on original hardware. Nick also mentioned that another very interesting thing is the music, composed by Luke Smith, which was a mod tracker built from 1-bit samples. He also said that because he and co-programmer David Leach had so many 8x16 multiples to do, he ended up writing a really powerful unrolled assembly routine to do it. I'll leave a link in the description to his documentation, where he explains how it works if you're interested in the actual assembly code behind it. Importantly, they had fun making it, even though it didn't sell many copies. Thank you once again to Nick for his time and insights into the creation of this game. Moving away from handhelds and onto consoles, Rick Cresson has a question about Swordmaster on the NES. The system doesn't support layering, but in the first level, it clearly looks like the mountains in the back are moving behind the trees, as well as the second level, but it's harder to see. And in the third level, the farthest column of pillars is scrolling at a different rate and going behind the other two layers. Can I tell you how all of that's working? Sure thing, let's cut it open to see what's inside. So here's the first level in the game, and we can see the mountains in the background moving at a different rate to the trees, and also seem to be on a layer behind them. This technique is actually the same technique we saw earlier in Asterix on the Game Boy. The mountains are tiles that are animated to move when the player does, making them appear as though they are moving independently behind them. The trees, in turn, are moving at a different rate to the ground the player walks on. This isn't the same thing. Neither the tree tiles nor the ground are individually animated like the mountains are. In this case, the game is utilising the help of the mapper chip inside the cartridge, the MMC3 specifically, which included a scanline counter. It uses this to fire off an interrupt on scanline 190 to scroll these two segments of the background layer at different speeds. It's also using it to keep the HUD fixed to the top of the screen too, by the way. It's sometimes easy to forget the NES couldn't do that by itself. Level 3 is doing exactly the same thing, it's just using different background tiles to create the effect. What's actually interesting is that if we look at the animated tiles themselves, the developers have opted to have all of the animated tiles they'll ever need always loaded into VRAM. You can see the mountains in level 1, the archways and pillars in level 3, and the animated backgrounds we see in other levels all loaded in and still animating when the player moves, regardless of what level the player is currently playing. They don't just load in the ones they need for the current level, they are just always all loaded in. That's one way to be efficient, I guess. RaffyCat1049 has a question about Solstice on the NES. Somehow they managed to render an isometric 3D game, with sprites moving between or behind the background layers, and they'd love to know how that was done. Let's look down onto this one to figure it out. So, Solstice, also known as Solstice: The Quest for the Staff of Demnos, is one of those isometric puzzle games. The controls in this one are a bit weird, for me anyway, because the movements are all diagonals, but you only press up, down, left and right to move. This was an original game for the console, not a port, and it got a sequel on the Super Nintendo called Equinox. The question in this case is asking about what's going on when the character sprites walk behind parts of the background, such as pillars, like we see here. That's easy, you might be thinking. That's using sprite priorities, like when I explained how Faxanadu worked. Yes, thank you to those comments who corrected me that it's pronounced Faxanadu and not Faxanadu. Anyway, in that game, it switched to sprite priority from high to low in order for sprites to look like they are passing behind parts of the background layer, so that's surely what's going on here too, right? Actually, no. This is being done in a totally unique way that I don't think I've seen before. The sprites themselves, that are loaded into the sprite RAM, are actually having masking applied to them on the fly. As the layout of each room is fixed, it looks like each specific room is set up to specify which parts of it should mask the sprites, and the relevant pixels in the sprite tiles turn transparent accordingly to make it look like they are passing behind them. The game uses CHR-RAM, which amongst other things allows it to change tiles in smaller increments and generate tile data in real time, and this seems to be the key to this. Usage of CHR-RAM wasn't particularly rare, roughly 25% of the NES library used it, but I can't think of too many games that used it like this. I wanted to ask Michael Webb, the programmer behind Solstice, some more about this, however I couldn't manage to contact him, and only found this making of video recorded around the time of the game's release, but he never explains exactly how he coded this. But this footage of some early prototypes does show how they were experimenting and testing this system of being able to move behind objects. I'll leave a link in the description to the full video if you're interested, which also includes some information from Tim Follin about the creation of the game's soundtrack. We're heading to the PC Engine next, with 2 questions about the Japanese exclusive PC ECD shoot 'em up Metamor Jupiter. The first one is from XC Altoona, who says it has a very good looking rotating cylinder effect in the background of stage 3. Secondly, Dylan Abit mentioned that there's a level or boss with a scrolling blue and white background, but periodically there are shifting segments of the pattern that sort of shift differently while still flowing with the rest of the background. I've grouped these 2 questions together because it's actually almost the same effect, so let's spin up that disc and check it out. The PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 had so many shoot 'em ups that it's easy to get lost in them all. Metamor Jupiter is probably about average, with some nice effects, a good soundtrack and voice-acted cinematics, but the gameplay is a bit hit and miss, although you can actually turn your ship around with the press of a button to shoot at stuff behind you, which was actually really rare to see, so that's a nice addition. The first question is referring to this effect in stage 3. As you fly into a space station, a big laser shoots at you and then you're in a rotating tunnel that wouldn't look out of place on the Mega Drive or Super Nintendo. Since the PC Engine had a scanline counter though, we know how this is working. It's offsetting the scrolling of the scanlines, where those at the top and bottom of the screen push further to the right than those in the middle. It changes slightly every 2 scanlines, creating a semicircle shape if you visualize it. The background tile map itself is also constantly scrolling, altering both the speed and the direction of the scroll as the level progresses. To add to the effect, it changes just one colour in the palette, index 3 in palette 0 to be specific, as the scanline moves down the screen. This colour corresponds not to the backdrop colour, which is actually black, but to the background colour of the tile map. It's set up so the colours on those lines don't change regardless of how the tile map is scrolling, which helps to make it more convincing. The second question is referring to what we see here late in the game in stage 9. As I mentioned, this is actually almost the same technique as the one in stage 3. The only difference is there's a constant palette cycle happening on palette 0 in order to make the moving wave effect. The scanline offsets and scrolling are still there to create the bend, although in this case the scrolling doesn't change its speed and direction and just moves in a continuous trajectory. Moving on to the Mega Drive, it's time to take a look at the last game Treasure made for the console, Light Crusader, with these questions that were left by SU76M and TWood1130. They both basically have the same question here. They want to know if the doors are actually 3D polygonal objects, or whether they are sprites or perhaps some other trickery. Let's shed some light on this one. As we can see, Light Crusader is another isometric game, this time on the Mega Drive, although it's much more action-oriented than something like Solstice. It was made by Treasure, a studio that understood Sega's hardware very well and is completely different to anything they had done before. It was their final 16-bit game before moving on to the 5th gen consoles. Overall, the game looks very good with some neat effects, and one of those are these doors that you see in many places throughout the game's dungeons, which look like they are actually 3D polygons. So, are they? The answer is no, they aren't, they are sprites. That will either disappoint you or impress you, depending on how you look at it. They are made up of 2D animated sprite tiles that also do a palette swap as the door opens, to make it look more like these doors have depth to them. We do know Treasure were playing around with polygons on the Mega Drive in some of their previous games, which we have explored in past videos, but not this one it seems. It's a pretty cool detail they added to the game either way. Dirk One Steel mentions that one of the bosses in Puggsy on the Mega Drive scales very smoothly in and out of the screen during the fight. The game is also available on the Mega CD, which has scaling hardware, but the Mega Drive did not. How was it achieved, and did both systems do it the same way? Great question. Let's zoom in to take a closer look. Puggsy is a game that many of you are probably quite aware of because it was coded by the legendary John Burton, who runs the YouTube channels Coding Secrets and Game Hut, which I've mentioned in past videos a number of times. On these channels, he explains how he managed to do a lot of the tricks we see in his games on Sega hardware, and normally I just direct you over to his channels to find the answer to this one, but unfortunately he never covered this specific effect himself. This is it running on the base Mega Drive, and the boss does scale both larger and smaller extremely smoothly, so how on earth did he do this? Well, if you cast your mind back to the very first video I did in this series, when I was talking about the final boss fight in The Lawnmower Man, it's the same technique being used here. The boss's main body is on a background plane, in this case plane A, and is manually animated to horizontally stretch and contract by adding in or taking away tiles that make up the image. While that's happening, it's using the Mega Drive's ability to stretch or compress a background plane vertically by rendering extra lines or omitting the rendering of lines respectively, which is a concept I covered in my previous video. Doing both at the same time produces the really smooth scaling effect that we see in the final game. As for the second part of the question, about whether the Mega CD version does the same thing, this is the boss fight, and you should be able to instantly tell it's different. This is because it doesn't need to do the same trick on this hardware. The Mega CD had its own rotation and scaling capabilities built in. So in this version, it's just using that rather than the software-based solution. Staying with the Mega Drive, Kurlos3284 asks me to cover gradients and scaling on the console, such as in games like Yogi Bear's Cartoon Capers and The Simpsons' Bart's Nightmare. Both games happen to use the same technique for both of these things, so let's take a look. It's just a coincidence that both of these games are based on popular cartoons. Yogi Bear's Cartoon Capers was a European exclusive on Sega's console, though the Super Nintendo version did also get a North American release as The Adventures of Yogi Bear. It was clearly intended for younger players, so with that in mind, it's decent enough. The Simpsons' Bart's Nightmare though is a notoriously bad and frustrating game to play, which is a shame because a lot of effort was obviously put in to make it look and sound authentic to the show, and it has some decent ideas that are just poorly executed. So firstly, the colour gradients. Bart's Nightmare has a gradient in the background of this stage where he's swimming in the bloodstream, and Yogi Bear has one in the background of these Dreamtime bonus stages. In both of these games, these are achieved not by modifying the backdrop colour, but modifying a colour on one of the background planes, in this case, plane B. As the scanline moves down the screen, it changes just this colour index while leaving the rest untouched, and just like we saw Metamor Jupiter doing on the PC Engine, keeps this value as the background is scrolling. As you can see, in both of these games, there's other stuff on this background layer with a gradient on it, but by keeping the colour setting of each scanline constant, it's able to make it look like the other parts of this layer are vertically scrolling independently. You'll probably notice in both of these cases that the colour isn't changing on every single scanline. The colours are separated into noticeable larger chunks. Neither the Mega Drive, nor the PC Engine for that matter, had dedicated hardware to do this kind of thing like the Super Nintendo had with HDMA, so it needed to be done in software which cost CPU time. They both had a CPU fast enough to do it, but you wouldn't want to do it on every scanline or it would affect performance too much. On the Super Nintendo, the colour change in the gradient in Bart's Nightmare is done on the backdrop colour and happens more frequently, resulting in a smoother and less obvious blend, although you can still notice it if you look closely. In Yogi Bear, interestingly, they opted not to use a gradient at all and went for an entirely different vignette effect with the colour mats hardware. Secondly, the scaling. Bart's Nightmare does a pretty good scaling trick during these brief cutscenes when Bart jumps through a window or enters a door, and you can see it rotating and scaling smaller as he's falling. In Yogi Bear, you see a scaling effect in the intro, with Yogi's head zooming in and then zooming back out again. Both effects are quite smooth, but we know the Mega Drive didn't have scaling hardware, so how are they done?
It's an illusion.
No, it's not.
Turns out they just brute forced it. They made all of the tiles they needed in all of the sizes and orientations that were required to create these animations and loaded them all into VRAM. We can see them all if we take a look at the individual tiles in memory. The ones in Bart's Nightmare are reasonably simple shapes without many colours, so there's enough space left for Bart's animation. Yogi Bear's tiles take up a lot more space, about half of the total available VRAM, but there's nothing else happening during this animation, so they can get away with it. So if you guessed that, give yourself a pat on the back. In comparison, the Super Nintendo versions obviously just use Mode 7 for both of these effects. Bart's Nightmare is a bit smoother and a bit longer, but looks more or less identical, although it has a different animation for entering doors for some reason, and there are extra scaling effects added in various places in the game that are not present in the Mega Drive version. The Yogi Bear animation is a bit different, because instead of zooming in to a predetermined size and then zooming back out again, it continues to zoom until it fills the whole screen. Replicating this on the Mega Drive would have probably needed more tiles than was possible to fit into VRAM, so they just opted to zoom into a fixed size and then reuse those tiles in reverse to zoom out. Moving on to the Super Nintendo, or the Super Famicom in this case, Dear Crowns has two questions, but I've already answered that first one in previous videos, so I'm just looking at the second one. They ask, in Seiken Densetsu 3, which we now know in English as Trials of Mana, how does the game graphically implement its day-night cycle? Let's not lose any sleep over this and see how it's done. If you're unaware, Seiken Densetsu 3, or Trials of Mana, is the sequel to Secret of Mana, which was known as Seiken Densetsu 2 in Japan. Unlike Secret of Mana, it has an interesting day-night cycle in the game, one of the few RPGs from this time that did, and even a 7-day week calendar. Each day of the week is named after a specific elemental, and spells from that elemental are stronger on the specific day that corresponds to it. It's an interesting concept, though in practice it doesn't make a huge difference to gameplay. The question is specifically asking about how the day-night cycle works visually, and this would be a pretty quick answer, as on the scale of things it's pretty simple and there isn't much to it. All that happens is the game is doing a palette swap, although rather than just changing a few colours or a few palettes, it's changing almost every colour on almost every palette, for both the backgrounds and the sprites. They gradually all change to a darker shade for night and a brighter shade for day. In what I think is a neat little detail, the colour on the windows of the buildings in towns actually gets brighter during the night transitions, turning from a dark blue and grey to a yellow to make it look like the lights are on inside. It's really cool when developers add finishing touches like this to make these worlds feel more like they are actually lived in. Finally, Bean the Beanie TPS 9574 says that in the results screen for the battle mode in Super Bomberman 3 on the SNES, your character is shown being rotated and scaled in front of a background. How is that possible if Mode 7 only supports one layer? Let's end the video with a bang and reveal this mystery. Super Bomberman 3. I have lots of memories playing this one as a teenager with friends who actually had a multi-tap, so we had 4 and even 5 player multiplayer happening. For some reason, North America never got this game, so this was one of those rare wins for those of us in PAL regions. This was and still is one of the best entries in this long-running series, in my opinion. I could gush about this game all day, but we are here to answer the question, which is referring to this cutscene that happens in multiplayer when someone wins the required number of games to take victory in the set. The winner is thrown into the air by the other characters underneath them, and scales and spins towards the camera. The whole thing takes place on a boxing ring background with a crowd of Bombermen around the sides, and there's a big victory sign at the top of the screen. The winning character is being scaled and rotated with Mode 7, as the question correctly points out, but if that's the case, how is the game showing another background behind it? There's a few elements to this one, so let's break it down. We've established the winner is a Mode 7 background. No real mystery there, but the screen is being cleverly split here into several segments. The top portion, which ends on scanline 47, and the bottom portion, which starts on scanline 175, are Mode 1, although the game is only using one of the 3 available layers this mode provides. This is to display the crowd and edges of the ring at the top and bottom. Mode 7 is the middle portion, and the colour of the boxing ring itself is simply the backdrop colour, which has been set to a pale cyan. So what about the rest? Everything else you see is constructed out of sprites. Not just the other characters in the ring, but the crowd and edges on the left and right side are entirely made up of sprite tiles too, as is the victory text, which flashes alternate colours with palette swaps. Pretty much all of the sprite tiles are 16 by 16, rather than 8 by 8, so less of them are needed to build the scene than you might have realised. Cool, huh? Hudson Soft really knew their craft. This is the 10th video I've done in this series. I've now answered more than 140 questions, covering more than 80 games, and I'm not done yet. If you have your own question you'd like me to tackle in a future video, be sure to leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for continuing to contribute to this channel and going on this journey of discovery with me, as we appreciate the work that was done to give us these classic games. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.